In September 1957, an underground tank at the Mayak nuclear facility was overheating. This was not considered an emergency. The tank contained highly radioactive liquid waste, byproducts of plutonium production for nuclear weapons. These materials generated heat continuously through radioactive decay. To prevent disaster, the tank relied on an active cooling system. At some point, that system stopped working. No alarm was triggered, no evacuation was ordered, no public record was created. For months, the temperature inside the tank continued to rise. Mayak was operating under conditions of extreme secrecy. It was not a research center. It was an industrial site built to produce plutonium as fast as possible. Waste management was treated as a technical inconvenience rather than a critical risk. By the mid-1950s, radioactive waste had accumulated faster than it could be safely handled. Early disposal methods had already contaminated rivers. Underground storage tanks were introduced as a temporary solution. They became permanent by default. The tank that failed was buried beneath concrete and steel. Inside it, radioactive isotopes broke down, releasing heat. Without cooling, chemical reactions accelerated. Pressure increased slowly, invisibly. This process did not look dramatic. There was no fire, no warning signal, no visible damage. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. Above ground, the facility continued normal operations. Workers arrived for their shifts. Production quotas were met. Nearby towns functioned as usual. No one was informed that a large volume of radioactive waste was becoming unstable beneath their feet. On September 29, 1957, the pressure inside the tank exceeded structural limits. The explosion was chemical, not nuclear. The force was equivalent to tens of tons of TNT. A concrete lid weighing hundreds of tons was thrown into the air. A radioactive cloud rose above the facility and began drifting northeast with the wind. This was the moment the disaster occurred. It did not look like a catastrophe. There was no mushroom cloud, no immediate destruction, no visible sign that anything extraordinary had happened. What spread across the region was largely invisible. Radioactive particles settled onto forests, fields, and villages. People continued daily life unaware of exposure. Farmers worked contaminated land. Children played outdoors. Water sources were used as usual. The authorities did not announce an accident. Instead, they began managing the consequences quietly. Soldiers and workers were sent into affected areas without proper protection. Contaminated villages were monitored, not warned. Medical symptoms were treated individually, without explanation. Fatigue, burns, illness. Doctors were instructed not to mention radiation. Diagnoses were adjusted. Records were altered. Patterns were ignored. The radioactive plume formed what would later be called the East Ural radioactive trace, a contaminated corridor stretching hundreds of kilometers. Tens of thousands of people were exposed. Officially, nothing had happened. The disaster was absorbed into routine, distributed across time and geography until it no longer looked like a single event. But the consequences did not disappear. They accumulated in bodies, in soil, in data that no longer matched the official narrative. The explosion itself lasted seconds. The silence that followed would last decades. The explosion did not happen in an empty place. It happened at the center of a city that officially did not exist. The people who worked at Mayak lived in a closed settlement, hidden from maps and public records. Its name was replaced by a postal code. Letters were censored. Travel was restricted. Visitors required special clearance. Leaving required permission. For the state, this place was infrastructure. For its residents, it was home. Life inside the closed city was deliberately stable. Housing was better than average. Food supplies were reliable. Salaries were higher than in nearby towns. These benefits were not generosity, they were control. Silence was the price. Workers were rarely told what they were producing or why. Safety briefings were vague. Radiation exposure was described as minimal, manageable, or temporary. Questioning procedures was discouraged, sometimes punished. Doctors signed secrecy agreements. Medical records did not list radiation as a cause of illness. Symptoms were treated individually without context. Patterns were not discussed. Patients were not warned. Even acknowledging contamination could end a career. Outside the city, the situation was worse. Villages near Mayak relied on local rivers for water, fishing, and farming. For years, radioactive waste had been discharged upstream. People noticed illness, unexplained deaths, and deformities. They were told nothing. Complaints went nowhere. Local officials had no authority. Higher authorities had no incentive to investigate. The nuclear program was untouchable. Admitting failure meant admitting vulnerability. Inside Mayak, production pressure never eased. Plutonium output was tied directly to national security. Delays were unacceptable. Maintenance was postponed. Infrastructure aged. Temporary solutions became permanent by default. The underground waste tanks were a compromise that no one revisited. They were never designed for long-term storage. Cooling systems required constant monitoring, but monitoring depended on reporting problems upward, and reporting problems created risk for those who reported them. So problems stayed local. A failed cooling system was not a crisis. It was an inconvenience. By the time the tank overheated, the system had already decided how to respond, not with alarms, not with evacuation, but with containment of information. After the explosion, this logic intensified. Soldiers were deployed to contaminated areas without explanation. Cleanup crews worked without adequate protection. Villages were observed quietly. Evacuations, when they occurred, happened weeks or months later. Residents were told to leave without being told why. Homes were abandoned. Livestock was destroyed. Entire settlements disappeared from maps. No public acknowledgment followed. The land was fenced off and labeled as a nature reserve. The city remained closed. Inside it, life continued. Workers returned to their shifts. Children went to school. Officially, there had been no accident. The system absorbed the event and moved forward. But the people living there understood something was wrong. They saw illness increase. They saw neighbors disappear. They saw areas restricted without explanation. They learned not to ask questions. The closed city did exactly what it was built to do. It contained people. It contained information. It contained responsibility. And in doing so, it ensured that the disaster could unfold without resistance and without witnesses who were allowed to speak. The radioactive cloud did not stop at the facility's perimeter. Carried by wind, it moved northeast, spreading particles across forests, fields, and villages that had no connection to the nuclear program and no protection from it. This path would later be called the East Ural Radioactive Trace. At the time, it had no name. Radiation does not announce itself. It does not burn immediately. It does not look dangerous. People continued their routines. Crops were harvested, livestock grazed, rivers were used for drinking and washing. Children played outdoors in areas where radioactive particles had settled into soil and grass. No warnings were issued. Local authorities were not informed of the scale of contamination. They received vague instructions to observe conditions and report unusual developments. What qualified as unusual was never defined. Symptoms appeared gradually. Fatigue became common. Skin lesions were treated as minor burns. Hair loss was attributed to stress or poor nutrition. When illnesses worsened, cases were handled individually, without explanation. Doctors were instructed to avoid certain words. Radiation was one of them. Medical records listed generic diagnoses. In some cases, documents were classified. In others, they were altered. The goal was not treatment. It was containment of information. In villages closest to the plume's path, conditions deteriorated fastest. Animals fell ill. Crop yields declined. People noticed patterns they could not explain. Rumors spread quietly, without confirmation. Complaints reached local offices and stopped there. Higher authorities did not respond. Acknowledging the contaminated corridor would have required acknowledging the accident itself. That was not an option. Eventually, evacuations began. They were not immediate, and they were not complete. Some villages were relocated weeks after the explosion. Others waited months. A few were never evacuated at all. Residents were told they were being moved for administrative reasons. They were instructed to leave belongings behind. Homes were sealed or destroyed. Livestock was buried or slaughtered. The land was fenced off and later reclassified, often as restricted zones or nature reserves. There was no public explanation. The corridor continued to exist, even as it was erased from conversation. For years, people lived along its edges without knowing where contamination ended and safety began. Radiation measurements were taken secretly. Results were not shared with those affected. Some areas were quietly depopulated, others were monitored and left in place. The decision was not based on health. It was based on visibility. Places that drew attention were cleared. Places that did not remain occupied. Exposure continued unevenly, depending not on risk, but on administrative convenience. By the early 1960s, the contaminated corridor stretched hundreds of kilometers. Tens of thousands of people had been exposed to elevated radiation levels. Many would never be informed. Officially, the region was stable. Unofficially, it became a long-term experiment in exposure without consent. Data was collected. Medical observations were recorded. Environmental samples were analyzed. Patterns were studied quietly, without informing those whose bodies were providing the evidence. The corridor became a source of knowledge, but not for the people living in it. They were not patients. They were variables. The disaster had moved beyond the explosion. It had entered its second phase, management. Not management of risk, but management of awareness. Once the contaminated corridor was identified internally, the response followed a familiar pattern. There was no public acknowledgment. There was no declaration of emergency. There was no admission that an accident had occurred. Instead, the situation was handled administratively. Evacuations were framed as routine relocations. Villages were told their land was being repurposed. In some cases, residents were informed that new industrial projects required their departure. In others, no explanation was given at all. People were given little time. They were instructed to pack essentials and leave behind furniture, tools, and personal belongings. Houses were sealed or demolished. Wells were filled in. Fields were abandoned. Entire settlements vanished within weeks. Maps were updated quietly. Village names disappeared. Roads were rerouted. The land was fenced off and labeled as restricted. Later, some of these areas would be redesignated as protected natural reserves, their true purpose concealed behind environmental language. This served two functions. It limited access, and it removed human witnesses. The people who were relocated were not told the reason. They were not informed of contamination. They were not offered medical explanations for symptoms that followed them to new homes. Many assumed they had done something wrong. In the absence of information, fear turned inward. Those who remained in contaminated areas experienced a different form of management. They were observed. Medical examinations were conducted under the guise of routine care. Blood samples were taken, symptoms were recorded, results were classified. Patients were not informed of findings that indicated radiation exposure. Doctors were instructed to follow protocols that emphasized discretion. Certain diagnoses were discouraged. Certain terms were forbidden. Records that suggested a common cause were separated to prevent pattern recognition. The goal was consistency, not medical accuracy, but narrative stability. Cleanup operations followed similar logic. Soldiers and workers were deployed to contaminated zones with minimal protection. Tasks included soil removal, burial of contaminated materials, and construction of barriers. Exposure limits were not clearly defined or enforced. Rotation was irregular. Some workers remained in high-exposure zones far longer than others. Records of individual doses were incomplete or non-existent. Long-term health consequences were not discussed. These operations were described internally as necessary maintenance. Externally, they did not exist. The absence of public acknowledgment created a unique problem. Without an official disaster, there could be no official victims. Compensation was impossible. Accountability was irrelevant. The system could not respond to claims that were never allowed to be made. Over time, the lack of explanation became normalized. People learned not to ask why certain areas were off limits. They accepted that villages had been removed for reasons they would never be told. Illness became something personal rather than systemic. This normalization was crucial. It allowed the aftermath to be managed indefinitely without escalation. The disaster remained fragmented, spread across geography, time, and bureaucracy. No single event could be pointed to. No single decision could be challenged. By the early 1960s, the most visible consequences had been contained. The landscape had changed. The population had been reshaped. The contaminated corridor was largely inaccessible. From the outside, the region appeared quiet. Inside the system, the disaster had been absorbed. But absorption did not mean resolution. The radioactive materials remained in the soil. Exposure continued at lower levels. Health effects unfolded slowly over years and decades. The accident had not ended. It had been stabilized. What followed was not recovery, but endurance, for both the environment and the people who had been placed within it. The effects of radiation exposure did not arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, unevenly, and without clear boundaries. In the years following the explosion, illness increased across the contaminated corridor, not in dramatic spikes, but in patterns that were easy to dismiss individually. Fatigue became chronic. Infections lingered. Cancers appeared earlier than expected. Birth defects occurred more often, though rarely acknowledged as such. There was no official list of victims. Without a recognized accident, there could be no recognized exposure. Without exposure, there could be no causation. Each case existed in isolation, detached from geography or history. This fragmentation was intentional. Medical records were kept locally and classified selectively. Diagnoses emphasized immediate symptoms rather than underlying causes. When patterns emerged, they were studied internally, not communicated externally. Doctors were placed in a contradictory position. They observed clear correlations between residents, exposure, and illness. At the same time, they were bound by secrecy regulations that limited what they could record and how they could speak. Treating patients was permitted. Explaining their condition was not. Many patients sensed this gap. They noticed evasive language. They recognized that questions went unanswered. Over time, people learned to stop asking. The absence of explanation became part of everyday life. Children were affected differently. Growing bodies absorbed radiation more readily. Developmental issues appeared years later, long after families had been relocated. By then, links to place had been severed. The corridor existed only in memory, and memory carried no legal weight. Epidemiological studies were conducted quietly. Data was collected across decades, forming one of the largest long-term radiation exposure datasets in history. The subjects of these studies were rarely informed that they were participating. Consent was not requested. Results were not shared. The purpose was understanding, not accountability. From the state's perspective, the data had value. It informed future safety limits, exposure models, and medical protocols. From the perspective of those exposed, it offered no relief. There was no closure. Without official recognition, suffering remained unacknowledged. Compensation was inconsistent or non-existent. Many affected individuals did not know why they were ill. Others suspected, but lacked proof. The absence of numbers mattered. Disasters are often measured by statistics: deaths, injuries, evacuations. The Kyshtym disaster resisted this framework. Its victims were dispersed, effects were delayed, exposure varied widely. There was no single figure that could capture the damage. This ambiguity protected the narrative. It allowed the disaster to remain abstract, technical, and distant. Without a clear toll, it could be treated as an administrative problem rather than a human one. Time compounded the effect. As years passed, witnesses aged and died. Records remained sealed. New generations grew up unaware of what had occurred beneath their region. The corridor faded from public consciousness, even as its effects persisted. By the time information began to surface decades later, the human cost was no longer something that could be counted precisely. It could only be inferred. The damage was real, but it had been distributed too widely and too quietly to confront directly. This was not an accident with an end. It was an exposure without resolution. Silence after the disaster was not accidental. It was organized. Within weeks of the explosion, information about Mayak and the surrounding region was compartmentalized. Reports were classified. Communications were restricted. Discussion of the event was limited to internal channels that did not overlap. The word accident was avoided. Documents referred instead to technical irregularities or local contamination. These terms reduced urgency and obscured scale. They allowed the system to treat the event as manageable rather than exceptional. Scientific institutions were instructed to comply. Researchers studying radiation effects in the region were required to submit findings through controlled channels. Publication was restricted. International collaboration was prohibited. Data that contradicted official assessments was withheld or reclassified. This did not stop research. It redirected it. The contaminated corridor became a closed laboratory. Long-term studies were conducted without public acknowledgment. Observations were precise, systematic, and ethically detached. The results informed nuclear safety standards while remaining invisible to those who had provided the data with their bodies. Journalists were excluded entirely. The region was closed. Travel permits were denied. Maps were altered. Even the names of affected settlements disappeared from public records. Without access, there could be no investigation. The silence extended into everyday language. Residents learned which topics were unsafe. Radiation was not discussed openly. Illness was framed as personal misfortune. Evacuations were remembered without explanation. Over time, these emissions became normalized. Children grew up unaware that their environment had ever been different. Medical professionals internalized the rules. Some complied out of fear. Others believed that maintaining silence prevented panic. A few attempted to document what they saw privately, preserving notes that would not surface until decades later. The policy was effective. For years, the outside world remained unaware that a major nuclear disaster had occurred. International monitoring systems were limited. Radioactive contamination was detected sporadically, but without context. There was no official admission to confirm suspicion. When questions arose, they were deflected. The Soviet Union acknowledged no large-scale accident. What could not be denied was minimized. Without confirmation, the story could not solidify. Silence protected more than secrecy. It protected continuity. The nuclear program continued operating. Production goals were met. Lessons were absorbed internally without public reckoning. The cost was externalized onto people who could not speak. Time reinforced the policy. As years passed, urgency faded, documents aged, personnel changed, memory fragmented. What remained was a system that had successfully absorbed a disaster without destabilizing itself. But silence is not permanent. It delays exposure. It does not eliminate it. Eventually, inconsistencies accumulated. Independent scientists noticed patterns. Medical anomalies persisted. Environmental data contradicted official narratives. The truth did not emerge suddenly. It leaked. And when it did, it revealed not only an accident, but a deliberate strategy of containment. One that treated information as a variable to be controlled, just like radiation itself. The truth did not arrive with an announcement. It emerged slowly through contradiction. By the 1970s, scientists outside the Soviet Union began noticing anomalies. Radiation measurements in parts of the southern Urals did not align with known incidents. Medical studies hinted at long-term exposure patterns that could not be explained by normal industrial activity. There was no official explanation to compare against. Inside the Soviet Union, a small number of researchers were already aware that something was wrong. They had access to restricted data. They saw correlations that could not be dismissed. But access did not mean freedom to speak. What changed was not the data. It was the political climate. As decades passed, the urgency that had driven absolute secrecy weakened. Personnel retired. Documents accumulated. The internal logic that had justified silence began to fracture under its own complexity. The first public hints came indirectly. In the late Cold War period, Soviet scientists began publishing carefully worded studies on radiation exposure in the Urals. Locations were anonymized. Causes were abstracted, but the scale was unmistakable. These were not minor incidents. Western analysts noticed. The pieces did not fit existing narratives. No reactor accident had been reported. No weapons test explained the contamination. Yet the data suggested a large, concentrated release of radioactive material decades earlier. Questions followed. Inside the Soviet Union, openness increased unevenly. Some archives remained sealed. Others were quietly reclassified. Journalists gained limited access to previously closed regions. Survivors began speaking cautiously, often without names or dates. The name Kyshtym entered discussion not because it was accurate, but because it was allowed. The actual site, the Mayak Production Association, was still sensitive. Referring to a nearby town created distance between the disaster and the facility that caused it. This naming itself was a form of control. By the late 1980s, official acknowledgment became unavoidable. Environmental damage was too extensive to deny. Medical evidence was too consistent. International pressure increased. Statements were released. They were limited, technical, and carefully framed. The event was described as an accident involving waste storage, not a failure of the nuclear program as a whole. Casualty figures were vague. Responsibility was diffuse. Even acknowledgment was managed. For those who had lived through it, recognition came late and incompletely. Many had already died. Others had spent decades without understanding why their lives had been altered. There was no comprehensive apology. There was no full accounting. What emerged was a partial truth, constrained by the same structures that had produced the silence in the first place. The disaster was finally visible, but it was still not fully owned. The Kyshtym disaster did not change the Soviet nuclear program overnight. It did not stop production. It did not lead to immediate reform. What it revealed was something quieter and more enduring. It showed how a system behaves when secrecy becomes more important than safety. The explosion itself was not unprecedented. Industrial accidents happen. Technical failures occur. What made this disaster different was not the event, but the response. The decision to manage consequences without acknowledgment transformed a localized failure into a long-term human and environmental crisis. The system treated radiation as a technical variable. Information was treated the same way. Both were contained, redirected, and diluted rather than confronted. Exposure was managed statistically rather than personally. Harm was accepted as an abstract cost rather than an individual reality. This approach was effective in one sense. The program continued. The state avoided panic. International scrutiny was delayed. From an administrative perspective, stability was preserved. From a human perspective, something else was lost. Trust eroded quietly. People learned that disappearance could occur without explanation, that relocation could happen without cause, that illness could be treated without truth. These lessons did not remain confined to one region. They spread. The disaster demonstrated the limits of control. Secrecy delayed accountability, but it did not erase consequences. Radiation persisted in soil and water. Health effects unfolded over decades. Data accumulated until it could no longer be reconciled with silence. When acknowledgment finally came, it was incomplete. The passage of time made full reckoning impossible. Responsibility was diffused across institutions that no longer existed in their original form. Victims were dispersed, records fragmented, causes abstracted. The story ended without closure. What remains is not a single lesson, but a pattern. When progress is pursued under extreme pressure, safety becomes negotiable. When information is controlled, harm becomes harder to trace. When systems prioritize continuity over correction, failure does not end. It stabilizes. The Kyshtym disaster was not the result of a single decision. It was the outcome of many small decisions aligned in the same direction. None of them dramatic, none of them heroic, all of them consequential. This is why the disaster matters. Not because it was hidden, but because it showed how easily harm can be absorbed into routine, and how long it can persist once it is. The explosion lasted seconds. The silence lasted decades.